program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Watch Mojo and the Inside Mojo podcast, where each week we look back on Watch Mojo's 20-year history on YouTube. I'm your host, Rob, and with me, as always, is Watch Mojo's co-founder and CEO, Ashkan Karbasfrooshan. Ash, we did it. We made the playoffs.
We did. Yeah, no, I'm very excited. The Canadians made the playoffs. I mean, the last time we made the playoffs in 21, it was during the COVID bubble. So we kind of made it to the Stanley Cup finals.
Kinda.
But it's a bit of an asterisk. So, this time I think the city is quite surprised and impressed. Again, when you have a good culture, obviously they're a very talented team. It's the best built team that the Habs have had since I've been following them in 86 when I was 8. But no, when you have a good culture and when you have talent, a lot of things come together. And if you don't have a good culture, there's no amount of talent that could offset that. So you're seeing a lot of things aligning for this young Habs team, and we are just stoked.
Yeah, very young team, actually. What are your expectations for this playoff run?
So believe it or not, hockey has an interesting pattern where sometimes when teams just have an incredible regular season, when they're on a high, they kind of, they deflate in the playoffs. And then the next year they go on, generally, they learn. Like a couple of years ago, the Boston Bruins, who as a Habs fan, I must hate, but clearly respect.
Yes, we're obligated to hate the Bruins.
We're obligated. It's in the passport. The Bruins set a record for the best regular season, and then they lost to the Florida Panthers, and they were shocked. And then because of his retirement, this year they didn't even make the playoffs. So with the Habs, I do feel like they have zero pressure. They're taking on the Washington Capitals, whom we beat in 2010. And this time, I think Ovechkin this year was kind of very euphoric, chasing Wayne Gretzky's record. In some ways, I think the Capitals may feel like that was their high, like subconsciously, like they already won something. So there is an element of upset. And as one general manager in our past used to say, once you make it into the playoffs, anything can happen. And I think more so than other sports, in hockey, Stanley Cup is the toughest championship to win. It's a grueling, you got to win 4 rounds, best of 7 series. So we're stoked. I mean, it's like we're loving it. And then at the end, we have not just the best young defenseman in Lane Hudson. Now we just got probably arguably one of the most talented young prospects in Ivan Demidov. So, I mean, we're kind of on a high.
Very exciting. Go Habs, go. All right. This week, we're talking about being a made man in entrepreneurship. What can we expect for this episode?
So, let's discuss it this way. So entrepreneurship, as we've talked on the show and as I've written and studied for like a couple decades now, has become this thing, where we think of entrepreneurs as these like rock star tech guys. And we look to them, the media looks to them like as kind of, these like smart people with a lot of principles. And I've kind of said, let's calm down. Like Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook to rate the attractiveness of his classmates at Harvard. Evan over at Snap started that so they could send 6-second nude pics. Like, let's be honest. Jeff Bezos, really smart guy. I mean, let's just be clear. He was an analyst. He just picked Amazon, originally called Abracadabra, just because he was like, books are an easy thing to warehouse, et cetera, et cetera. And because of timing, being relatively early, and because of a low interest rate environment where money was cheap, they were able to scale these global platforms and become super wealthy. Like not old style wealthy, like, oh, they're, got $1 billion, like Jeff Bezos is worth 100 billion. Mark Zuckerberg is worth 50, 60. And in North American Western culture, we do sadly look up to the rich, even if some of them are lucky, some of them just inherited, some of them can be scoundrels. So today's show, I just want to talk about how that has changed. And throughout history, a lot of people have been entrepreneurs. Now we just view it, we associate it with tech entrepreneurs, but it's always been this kind of new frontier that very entrepreneurial people have changed. And we'll talk a little bit about, has venture capital ruined that? Has it created this false set of objectives and purpose? And so that's some of the themes we'll touch on today.
Sure. Let's start by talking about the origins of entrepreneurship. You wrote an article that refers to profit versus profits. Can we get into that a little bit?
Sure. Well, the right juxtaposition is profit, PROFIT, and purpose, and it's fine. Some people are very much driven. They want to become entrepreneurs because they just want to be rich. But yeah, so in our kind of preparation for this, I use profit, PROPHET. And so, I kind of went down a rabbit hole some time ago, and I was like, if you go throughout history, really the first people who were entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial were the prophets. And in some ways, their disciples were intrapreneurs. But if you think about it, Zoroaster, who founded Zoroastrianism, Moses, and the 10 Commandments that we at WatchMojo obviously look up to, they all claim to have heard messages from God. And I'm agnostic. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But it was really about a vision, about a way to operate. At the time, your daily life, you had a bunch of nomads, you had a bunch of people living. There were no real social constructs. There were no norms, no rules of engagement. How do you decide? It's funny, Zoroastrianism, which is a great religion in terms of good and evil, living, well, doing right, fending off temptation and all that. Those concepts obviously inspired Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. But like Zoroastrianism, actually, at the time, you could marry like your sisters or your whatever, your family. But okay, over time with science and medicine and biology, they realized maybe some of these things don't make sense. But my point here is just to say that if we're going to be candid, if you go back thousands of years, the first entrepreneurs were the prophets. And then once kind of a religion framework was established, like to kind of guide people in terms of how to live, you really had these kings and commanders who were the first entrepreneurial folks. Cyrus the Great, Kurosh Bozorg, he built the first global empire. He introduced the Cyrus cylinder, which was the foundation. It was version 1.0 of the Declaration of Independence that America is built on, right? He inspired Thomas Jefferson, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a born on first base entrepreneur. His father, Philip of Macedon, was already king. His mother, Olympia, was like a political operative, so to speak. His destiny was, so to speak, destined to be a king. And they were literally the first people who would kind of like gather around people, employees, tell them this is the vision, this is why we're doing this. And it was sometimes emotional. We are going to go avenge the Persian Empire burning of Athens in 480 BC, as Alexander would say. Sometimes it was purely profit. Hey, if we want to have a better life, we need Egypt's wheat. We need Persia's gold. Whatever the purpose or profit, the prophets and the kings were kind of entrepreneurial in that sense. Then eventually you had explorers. Columbus was the first, one of the first types of entrepreneurs who went up to angel investors, and those were the Genoese bankers, to ask for money. Or then he would go to a venture capitalist or a private equity fund, the king, to say, give me money. And then eventually you had, inventors and scientists. Thomas Edison, prolific patent holder. You could technically argue that, we've discussed how Edison's patents led to a lot of the Warner Brothers folks to leave the East Coast, go all the way to the West Coast to build like a geographic buffer so they could compete kind of unfairly, right? So like the themes of entrepreneurship have kind of carried. And then eventually the media barons, Joseph Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst, Henry Luce, Rupert Murdoch. Some of these were self-made. William Randolph Hearst actually borrowed $10 million, which at the time was like asking for $100 million from his mother to buy the San Francisco newspaper, and that became his base of empire. Same thing with Rupert Murdoch. All to get to today, where you had technologists, and this is really the era that, like, I think we in 2025 think of entrepreneurs as Elon Musk's. But my point is, it's always been the new frontier, and I would say, to bring it all together with YouTube, storytellers. I feel today, really influencers, creators, storytellers, these are the real entrepreneurs now. These are the people who are basically believing in themselves and kind of wanting to walk to the beat of their own drum.
Yeah, cool to see this evolution. I just want to let our viewers know that we have a poll going up on our YouTube channel. So head over to Watch Mojo on YouTube and weigh in with your thoughts. We want to know, how do you view entrepreneurs? Are they rock stars? Are they leaders and mentors? Are they fakes and phonies? Or are they geniuses? So pick one of those four and we'll revisit the results at the end of the
Phony
episode.
is the Michael Jordan kind of phony. I'm kidding.
Well, we'll see. I'm curious about this one. Anyways, I'm not going to telegraph what I think my the responses will be, but we'll see when we get there. So we also have an interesting table that kind of tracks the richest people over time, adjusted for inflation. Let's take a look at that.
So yeah, this was something I think, I just came across. You always hear about inflation adjusted, and I was actually writing an article back in the day on Iran and just saying how, as the original first empire, it was obviously the wealthiest nation at one point. And then over time, if you fast forward to today, skip the gold, skip the other, minerals or things that led to its GDP. In the last century, it was because of oil and gas. And it got a lot of attention from the Brits, the Russians, and the Americans. And I noticed that whomever throughout history ruled over Iran, ancient Persia, happened to be the wealthiest because they consolidated a lot. So first Cyrus the Great, then Alexander the Great, and even Genghis Khan, who adjusted for present time, his net worth was actually 100 trillion, or it could be calculated as 100 trillion. And the technique was, they would say, okay, when Genghis Khan was ruling, let's say in the 12th century, what was the GDP of the world? And let's say if it was 120 trillion and he controlled, 80% of it, then they would say, well, he was on top of 100 trillion. But the point is, if you go back here, so today, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, this is a few months outdated, Bernard Arnault, who runs LVMH in France, you have all these uber wealthy people, and most of them, they didn't make this money like through cash flow. And this is to connect the dots. Back in the day, entrepreneurs would generally start a business and they would take risk, sometimes financial risk with debt, and they would incur losses until they found their product market fit, hit a tipping point, broke even, and then through cash flow would accumulate earnings over time. That's changed in the last 2-3, actually it's changed going back to the 1980s with private equity and then venture capital, angel investing, where a lot of people, their wealth is on their the ownership stake that they have. Like I understand the frustration when people are like, I can't pay for medication, I can't pay for groceries, tax the rich. I don't pay taxes. I mean, taxes fun. We're Canadian. We're a lot more left in that sense. America, like the GOP, all they care about is get rid of my taxes, right? So our mindset being Canadian is a bit differently. But when people are like out there, like tax the rich, Elon this and that, I'm like, he's not sitting on $200 billion of cash.
Yeah.
He's not hoarding gold in that sense. He's the owner of 4 or 5 businesses, and he owns, let's say, 20% of businesses that are worth $1 trillion. Ergo, that's the 200 billion. So if the value goes down, he may be broke, so to speak.
And he has like 13 children to pay for also. So
the children, the baby mamas. Yeah, I mean, he's prolific in that sense. He's open sourced his sperm, basically.
That's one way to put it.
Somebody else said that. I'm just repeating. But so my point is, there has been a shift culturally where it's gone from being master of your domain, running a profitable going concern, generating profits, reinvesting some, putting some away, to now you basically have a lot of people who are wealthy on paper because some investor came and said, well, I'm going to buy 20% of your business and I'm going to value it at 100 million. So here's 20 million. That 100 million is not real value, in my opinion. It's a notional amount where two parties agreed on a value on paper so that they could come to an agreement where party A sells a stake to party B, the investor. But when people then point to that big amount, I'm like, well, that nobody came and bought that. It's like you could say your house is worth 5 million and you could sell 1% of it to somebody because they want to be a homeowner, let's say. But your home is not really worth 5 million. Your home is only worth 5 million if somebody comes and gives you a check for 5 million for a set home.
Yeah,
basically.
A lot of people associate entrepreneurship with freedom, not working for anybody else, having control of your own destiny, so to speak. Do you agree with that? And has that changed over time?
Well, okay, yes and no. First of all, I think that is a paradox. It's a myth where you think freedom, but you're actually like entrepreneurs have to be servant in to succeed. You have to serve your employees, you have to serve your clients, you have to serve the community, whether you believe it or not or like it or not. So you don't actually have freedom in that sense. If anything, you're more like 247. If like, as an example, if you manage a team and you mess up and you're not there to fix it, guess who has to clean up the mess?
It's
right?
more responsibility at the end.
It's more responsibility, and it's 247. But yes, to the point you're making, I do admit that entrepreneurs are rarely driven by profit. Profit. It's not what drives us, because if you're driven by profit, you're going to go get a job that pays you a ton of money. There is purpose. There is another reason. There are insecurities. I think most of them is just freedom to do what they want. For me, I was at a point when I was 26, 27, where every time there was a problem, I wanted to resolve it one way. And my boss, it was his right. He was the CEO. He wanted to always resolve it in a way. And we didn't really agree on those principles. Not saying he lacked principles, just that we viewed things differently. So for me, it was freedom from that baggage, from that mental strain of every time there's an issue, I got to finagle my brain to, look at Donald Trump now. Donald Trump says something, one of his lieutenants goes out there, says something differently, and then they got to backtrack to do what our supreme leader Donald Trump wanted. Everybody's back Trumping these days. So yes, I do think it's freedom, but I don't necessarily think it's like literal freedom when you're like, I could do whatever I want, because you actually find yourself more or less free, so to speak,
Right. We've touched on this a little bit before. Not all of the biggest entrepreneurs in the world are self-made. A lot of them started on third base. What's your estimation of that? Who are the real ones who have kind of made it for themselves?
Okay, I don't want to shit on born on third base entrepreneurs, which is a term, I think it was Lawrence Switzer, who was a coach. He coached at Oklahoma, then he went to Dallas Cowboys. And he basically said some people are born on third base, but they wake up thinking they hit a triple, but they were actually born in the right family. So I want to and somebody asked, what do entrepreneurs do? So I'll segue to answer that. So the reality is there are some people who are born in certain families or to a certain father and mother who started a business and will either inherit or not. They actually have the privilege and the opportunity to not do anything. Some then choose to actually pursue, and to paraphrase Philip and Alexander, to build for themselves a kinder gradum for the one I leave you is too small type of thing. Those people I have nothing but respect for, because the insecurities and the traits that they need when they don't actually have to do anything to really, really make a name for themselves, I have nothing but respect. Now, sometimes they don't have a sense of awareness. Sometimes they think they hit a triple, but they were born on third base. But that doesn't take away from their ambition, their drive, their desire. And who am I to criticize them, right? But there is this I used to call it wantrepreneurs, ventrepreneurs, which are like not in it for the real thing, which is what is entrepreneurship? What do entrepreneurs do? Entrepreneurs is really somebody that mobilizes resources, recruits people, identifies a purpose, a goal, brings it all together with a plan to then accomplish a goal. Those are kind of what entrepreneurs do. So yes, if you break down those things, it is true that now you have way too many like entrepreneurs who want to be entrepreneurs, but they don't necessarily understand what it takes. Like, are you willing to sacrifice, forego immediate gratification for a possible future? Most people don't. Most people, for example, like when we used to meet people from Hollywood who would come and they wanted to talk about YouTube, the concept of risk was just foreign to them. They were like, well, I'm this and that. And I'm open to YouTube, but how do I get paid today? I was like, it doesn't work like that. It's a democratic platform. And they didn't understand that. They just had this sense of, expectations that is not really conducive to succeed. Mm-hmm. And then I also think, not to shit on the 99% of entrepreneurs who raise money from VCs, that the second you raise money from a VC early on, you're not really an entrepreneur anymore. You're an employee who has a lot of stock. You're a ventrepreneur, meaning you're their bitch. Whether you know it or not, they have legal priorities over you. There's things called liquidation preferences. There are things called veto rights. So you actually are no longer in control of your destiny. Like, even if you sell 1% of your business, it doesn't matter if you have control or majority, because there's legal terms that are attached to things. So yeah, the entrepreneurs who just want to be entrepreneurs but don't know what it takes, they're dead on arrival. The venturepreneurs are like Walking Dead, because eventually you're gonna be like, oh, you think you're hot shit, you think you're worth gazillions, you get like the covers of newspapers, you get invited to conferences, but then one day, Joe Pesci style, you walk into a boardroom and there's a bullet with your name on it. Then there's nothing you could do. And if you put up a fight, yeah, you may just drag out the inevitable. You'll be escorted face down out of the building. So, but entrepreneurs, old school, don't really exist. It's very rare to somebody to take the risk, like Hugh Hefner, who was based in Chicago way back and worked for Esquire. One day Esquire said, we're picking up and we're going to New York. And he was like, I don't really want to, but okay, pay me $5 more a week, which at the time may have been $500 more, $1,000 or whatever it was. And Esquire said no. So he said, okay, he was looking for a reason to stay back in Chicago. And then he started Playboy and he parlayed it into this empire. That's old school. Even even Richard Branson. Richard Branson took a lot of risks. I'm not here to shit on Richard Branson. Richard Branson is OG Hall of Fame level entrepreneur. But as I started my career and I started to research entrepreneurs, I realized like his later ventures carried no risk for him. He would basically leverage the Virgin brand to then go and bring in somebody else who would take the financial risk. Now, it's still entrepreneurship, but it's not the same thing.
Right. And speaking of the level of inherent risk involved in entrepreneurship, it is different for somebody who's completely started from zero and then somebody who did start on third base, because a failure for those two types of people looks very different. Like nobody is going to look down upon someone who started with nothing and didn't make it anywhere, but somebody who started with an advantage and ended up screwing it up is going to be looked at very differently.
Look, it's case by case, right? The reality is, that line I've said, hey, good luck with that business, pal. I always believed in you, buddy. Like, to be honest, like people not make fun in a malicious way. People were like, what are you building a business on YouTube? You're hiring all these unexperienced kids. Like, what are you doing? So it was hard. And if you fail, there are people who will dance on your grave, regardless of if you're like, self-made or if you're, born on third base. But look, to be honest, yeah, there are some born on third base people who destroy a ton of wealth. And they just kind of could still carry on even if they're ridiculed. But there are others who kind of use that. I mean, this is not a knock. This is actually a credit. So Montreal, one of the prominent families, the Bronfmans, the grandpa, I mean, I could see his house from here type of thing. There's a nice house on the mountain. The grandfather, Sam, I think, built Bronfman global liquor business here. And remember that line, behind every fortune is a great crime, by Honoré de Balzac. It was during Prohibition in the States. So they built their empire. He was a hustler. He was just driven. Then the second generation, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, the second generation built it up. And that was Stephen Bronfman? No, Stephen is the son. Charles Bronfman, sorry, and Edgar Bronfman. Like Edgar went to the States, Charles Bronfman built it up here. And then eventually their son, Edgar Bronfman Jr., he decided, like, I'm not interested in liquor. I'm not interested in DuPont. They own the stake in the chemicals company. He was like, I want to go into show business. A lot of people made fun of him because they're like, oh, rich kid. Well, now he's probably 70 or 65. But my point is, a lot of people bashed him. And I had started my career in media, and the stuff that he was talking about, synergy and streaming, he was just ahead of the curve. Now, he did do this merger with Universal in the States with Vivendi in France, and it destroyed a lot of shareholder value. So yes, it was fair to criticize him on the financial outcome. But in the end, the stuff that he saw, the vision he had was right. It was the timing that was off. But then he didn't kind of go and cry. And I'm not here as this PR guy. I'm just saying that you can't just simplify it as born on third base or not. He then went out and took a controlling stake in Warner Music, built that up. He's now, I think, the chairman, if not the Zone, maybe not the Zone, but he's the chairman of something else. But Fubo, I think. My point, though, is that when you're an entrepreneur, you do eventually develop the maturity to have a thick skin and block out all of that. Like, because you sometimes don't control it, right? There's some entrepreneurs who start and then COVID happens, it benefits them. They get a bunch of valuations and then they go up and then they die because that was just something that made sense in COVID when everybody was working from home. And then alternatively, there are some who do crash, but they kind of pick up the pieces and they don't, listen to the haters, and then they go and fulfill their destiny as an entrepreneur. You do only have to be right once, but it's not like if you're wrong once, then you can never repeat. It's up to you,
Right. With the advent of social media and things like this, entrepreneurs have kind of become celebrities in their own right, which has probably resulted in a lot of bullshit going along with
Way
it.
too much bullshit, yeah.
So tell me about that. What's your estimation of like the level of fame that some of these guys have, and which ones are genuine, and who,
Okay, so not to be a hypocrite, since we're doing a whole podcast and we're here, so like be careful what kind of stone I want to throw from this perch. I will say, though, that a CEO is ultimately the chief cheerleader of a company. So a CEO, like I've always said, I'd much rather be behind my computer firing off emails, working on content, working on partnerships, than like being on a stage at a conference, although I have to do that as well. But I know what I prefer. But the point is if as a CEO, you don't recognize that you're the chief cheerleader of the company, it is hard for the company to stand out, close deals, recruit, yada, yada. I've met so many wonderful people that we've hired who came up to me and said, hey, I heard you speak at this event, or I read this article, it resonated. So it is also like part of the racket to attract and all that. But too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So yes, in the era of the 2010s where if interest rates were low and there was so much money, it's kind of like tilted to the other extreme, where it was all about the noise and the PR and, rock stars. And there was nothing underneath there was no real foundation. So to me, the advice I would give is at a given time, you have to make noise. At a given time, you have to go behind and just be in the trenches. So over 20 years, yeah, from 2006 to 8, 9, I was maybe more out there trying to just learn and make contacts. In the mid 2000s, we were so busy, I was head down in the trenches just working. A couple of years ago, I was like, okay, COVID is behind us. I can't be totally off the radar. We need to get back out there. And then sometimes it's also more tactical, like, a means to an end. Like we were trying, in our case, like we were trying to develop podcasts. So I'm like, hey, this could work. But that's the key. There needs to be a raison d'etre. There needs to be a method to the madness. And there's way too many entrepreneurs who are kind of on this global rock star PR tour. I had actually invested in many startups. There was one, I like them. I like what they're doing and I understand, but it was like, bro, you haven't launched for a year. Every day you're in some other conference. We're just funding your travel lifestyle. Yeah. But I was like, Ash, you want to be an angel investor in startups. Not everybody's going to have the same. Now, eventually they launched and I never said anything to them because I knew the method to the madness. But I understand the optics of another investor who maybe wasn't operationally experienced could have been like, motherfucker, we're just funding this guy to go to one, beachside resort to another. And there's a balance, you have to be out there, but you can't be too out there. That can't be your product. Your product cannot be traveling around the world to conferences.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
We got another interesting question in. What is more critical, being able to pivot as the market changes or sticking to your vision despite the short-term challenges?
I mean, I hate the answer always, it depends, balance, but the answer is balance, and I'll explain very quickly. So for us, like I've already explained this, the vision of inform and entertain, the principles of producing content that people actually want to see or passionate about, like that did never change with us. Those fundamental, vision, beacon, purpose was always constant. But the tactics have to change. If we would have been focused on like Q&As, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, and we sit down with celebs and we ask them questions, but they don't really want to answer, the publicist keeps it dry. It's like vegetable lasagna interviewing, uncooked squash. Yeah, like that's not going to go anywhere. So you have to adapt. So I would say you want to keep the big vision stuff constant. You don't want to sell that out in that sense. But if your tactics are not leading to the desired outcome, absolutely. Just be careful not to pivot 4 times because you're back to square one.
taking it back to YouTube, which is our domain, the platform has allowed for a lot of young entrepreneurs to kind of like, take flight, and it's resulted in some huge businesses. Like if you look at Mr. Beast, for example, that's like, he's the biggest example right now. What do you think about that? How has YouTube enabled young people to kind of jump into the entrepreneurship lifestyle and kind of, build something for themselves?
Well, let's start off by saying Hollywood probably 120 whatever years ago was very entrepreneurial as well. Like whether you're Charlie Chaplin, whether you're Walt Disney, whether you're the Warner Brothers, I mean, those were the crazy outcasts and misfits and all that. And they probably started very entrepreneurial organizations. But then eventually everything gets fat, everything becomes more profitable, it attracts a lot of phonies and fakes and people who are just complacent, and then it loses that edge. And then there's this new thing that comes and disrupts it, right? So now we get to YouTube. So YouTube is ultimately just this new platform, as we've said, that is totally democratic. With a basic computer, your phone, you could edit and be a media company. There's no barriers to distribution. You could upload and you could use social media to build. So yeah, I think any new emerging platform technology lends itself well to disruption and innovation. It's not surprising, and this is why I came up with the whole concept of storyteller entrepreneur. It's not surprising that if Rupert Murdoch inherited his dad's newspapers, but he's an OG, he built it. Like you can't take anything away from him. He built Fox, So if Rupert Murdoch was walking in the streets of 2015, he probably would not go, to quote Warren Buffett, chop down some trees, hire a truck, run it through ink, print newspapers. He would be like, man, I get to overthrow democratically elected governments using YouTube. Fantastic. I get to undermine politicians this way, So it's just like a means to an end. So absolutely, YouTube has been super democratic. I love it as an outsider, yes, it's all perspective. To some, if you read my profile, you're like white, cisgender, male, fair. Okay. But I'm also Ashkan Karbasfrooshan, born in Iran, born Muslim, starting a career. So to me, I have nothing but gratitude for the internet and YouTube. Without it, I'd be not doing, the best version of me, so to speak. And I love the fact that this has created so much. But the next question, the good and bad in YouTube has been on an accelerated trajectory where after 20 years, it's stronger than ever. And yeah, I think, look, I'm going to say this about the internet. So I pitched an idea. I pitched two ideas. I was like, one was, do we want to do, please hear both sides. I was like, we could do top 10 OnlyFans celebs, like if we wanted for WatchMojo.
Not a bad idea, actually.
Not a bad idea, because there's interesting stories and, OnlyFans. But then I had read this expose on Reuters about all the bad parts of OnlyFans. So I wanted to do more of an essay type, the good, bad, and ugly of OnlyFans. Mm-hmm. I'm going to comment about OnlyFans, but it kind of appeals to just this fame-obsessed world. It does give a tremendous element of freedom, agency, to the 1% of 1%ers who succeed. That's good.
Yeah.
But I think people forget, it's like if every kid wanted to be an athlete, but they never went to school because they just thought they got the skills and then they're unemployed. The problem with YouTube and OnlyFans and social media is if you go all in hoping to be that 1%, and more kids in polls want to be creators than anything else, what happens when you're the 99.9%? So a lot of, using the OnlyFans, a lot of women gravitate when they're like, well, and I understand if you were like during COVID, if you were a strip club employee, a stripper, you now all of a sudden could use OnlyFans to make an income. But you also were like, well, I also don't put myself in situations around men that I'm uncomfortable, and I get to do it on my terms. So like you see the good even of something like OnlyFans, which again, clearly regardless of your morals, or, you could like or dislike. But then what happens when every young woman at 17, 18, 16, 18, 19, whatever, I'm assuming there's a legal age above which, but you just go, I'm going to go totally nude and I'm going to be on, well, you are limiting your options down the road.
Yeah.
In terms of employment and even relationships. And again, it's 2025. It's your life. It's your agency. Do what you want. But there are consequences. So that's a bit more extreme, talking about nudity and OnlyFans. But YouTube and social media is the same thing. I think it's fine. I am not somebody that will ever tell an entrepreneur or creator, don't go for it. Go for it. but understand the odds are really against you, you know? So if you go all into YouTube and you don't have a plan B, it could become a very, very depressing place where, you know, you waste your life when you have a ton of energy and a ton of creativity. So you also have to know when to pivot yourself.
Yeah. I mean, yes, when we're talking about the 1% of the 1%, we're talking about the people who've become very wealthy doing this stuff, but there is like a scale of success. And I think about this too in terms of music, because I spent a lot of energy in that over the course of my life. You don't necessarily have to be U2 playing at the O2 Arena. You could be having a successful career playing medium to small size
Yes.
clubs, you know, and still make a great living and enjoy what you do. But, you know, you're not a multimillionaire, but, you know, I think the same applies to YouTube as well, doesn't it?
It does, but the difference is if you're playing music, I think like music is what you love and you might try different genres. It's an outlet, yada, yada. The problem we have with YouTube, forget even OnlyFans, the problem we have with YouTube is, you know, I have a slide that goes, don't necessarily follow your passion, but what is your comparative advantage, demand and supply? There's way too many people. Like the idea of music and writing is there's always infinite number of people that are going to voice it, and many successful, like Van Gogh, it's like a myth. Was he poor when he died? Was he not? Okay, we could agree none of them were seen as geniuses. You know, their life was challenging. The problem with YouTube is like, what is it that you as a young person, it's like LinkedIn influencers. Like there's LinkedIn experts whose expertise is LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'd love to have a conversation with you about LinkedIn because I find that to be the most phony social media platform there is.
Okay, so a lot of feedback when people text me, they're like, you're so transparent, it's real. But I go, it's also because I can say things to open up, to show, because if you're a CEO, you're like of a company and you're not like a founder, yeah, your board might think this guy is, you know, losing it or this guy's too emotional. In my thing, it's a bit different. You know, some people know me as super conservative, super zen. Some people think I'm super crazy. But the reality is I could say things that the average person can't. So my LinkedIn is different, but that's why I don't spend that much time on LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. I like X. Yeah, it's the asylum. It's real time news, but you get to see people for their crazy inner selves, which I find more interesting. All I'm getting at is if you're young, yes, it's good to have an early advantage as a storyteller, but just understand you probably don't really have a story to tell. So then what that means is it becomes a bit of a it becomes a bit of a downward spiral where then everybody is just like, who is that super annoying? Is it Jack Doherty? There's one influencer who just goes around being a total cunt. That's the only word to say. So I'm like, okay, he's popular. He's driving flashy cars. So every young 13, 14-year-old, instead of saying, well, I still got to pay attention to school, or I'm going to have this hobby. I'm a great guitarist and I'm going to give tips. You know what I mean? But we've come to a place in society where everybody is just chasing attention and their expertise is being a bumbleclot. Yeah, I mean, that's not a good place for society to go. And that's also, again, tying it to entrepreneurship. You have people who have like, I'm on my 5th startup, none of them have worked. So maybe the problem is not the product or service you launch. Maybe you need to not be an entrepreneur. Maybe you should be an intrapreneur. Maybe you should be an executive, right? One problem where I go, the VCs fucked up all of entrepreneurship is because they decided to just give a ton of money, because it's only when they place money that they could charge management fees, to entrepreneurs that had no business being an entrepreneur. And I'm not saying that they cannot succeed, but they would have been more well served if they would have had some experience under their belt.
Yes, makes a lot of sense. So we got the results from our poll in, and they actually surprised me quite a lot because we asked, how do you regard entrepreneurs? And 57% said that they are rock stars, 22% said geniuses, 11% said leaders and teachers. And I thought the lead would have been fakes and phonies, but that only got 8%.
I know what's happening here, and not to overthink it. So I think when we did episode, this is a lot about algo, consistency. Like we initially were like, do we even put this on WatchMojo? And I was like, I sometimes chime in as the CEO. I rarely talk as talent because then people are like, well, it's because you're biased. But I was like, if you mofos are serious about podcasts and you want to do podcasts and you don't leverage WatchMojo, we're all a bunch of morons. You know, like we're not going to start a podcast and put it in the 3rd shelf in the attic and be like, nobody saw it. I think if we would have done this show if we would have done this poll in episode 1, the phonies would have been higher, because I think you would have gotten a larger proportion of like passersby on WatchMojo that had no idea what this is. By episode 13, I think what is happening is YouTube's algorithm is serving up this kind of content to people that legit care about entrepreneurship. So those people are not as skeptical, cynical, and like militant or jaded. You have people that are sitting here going, wow, this is useful as an entrepreneur. Oh, this is useful as a storyteller. So now I think that might explain a little bit what's happening, which is good, which shows again that YouTube, the algorithm works. It's not just a bad thing. It eventually finds the right audience for content and vice versa.
Yep, I would agree with that. So WatchMojo did bring on investors a few years back. Can you talk a little bit about that? What was the reason for that? How did that come about?
Sure. So I don't want to lie. I never, when I started, I've covered all this in my third book, 10-Year Overnight Success. So I got turned down by 100 VCs because they didn't really like content. And that's when we needed the money, and it was fine. Nothing illegal. I managed to stay afloat, yada, yada, found product market. Good. We're very profitable. We always had more strategics, like media companies, that were impressed with what WatchMojo was building, because they were like, you are creative, but you could read a P&L, you know, you're reasonable. You're not like extreme finance, extreme creativity. And they liked that WatchMojo was a brand, and they liked many things. But it was also admittedly not an obvious fit to do a partnership with a company to really grow WatchMojo faster. I told you by like 2015, 16, 10 years in, we were just this privately held company that was really doing well, but we could have been just a, house of cards. We could have been this mirage. So when Ernst & Young, whom we now work with, and it's genius of them, we didn't use Ernst & Young at this point. They just said, hey, we have the Entrepreneurship of the Year. And I was like, no, I'm not interested in that. But I remember going, it would be cool as a validation to say this accounting firm vetted us, did their due diligence, we're legit. So when we won, which was great, I always said this is an entrepreneurship framed for an individual, but it's really more for the team. And it was a source of pride, yada, yada. Now, 5 years later, we were still independent. And then when COVID hit, I was like, hey, man, we dodged a bullet. If one day Donald Trump as president goes, I don't like YouTube, I'm shutting down YouTube, and some force majeure externality happens to us, I am all alone, the way COVID was. And then on the flip side, COVID made half of the industries uninvestable. Like right now, if you're an investor and you invest in manufacturing, you're not going to make any moves until you figure out what happens with tariff. So in 2020, a lot of investors were like, oh, we're going to invest in this, travel thing. Well, not right now. We're going to invest in this social club where everybody hangs really close together. Well, we're not going to do that now. So home entertainment, we ended up getting a little bit more interest, and we didn't need the money, but I was like, which I know to some people, it doesn't make sense. I was like, I actually like governance. I like running a well-run administration and all that. And so I was like, if we bring on investors, it does signal again to the world that, hey, this is legit. A bunch of professionals came, vetted it. And to me, it was just like elevating the organization a bit more. So the combination of fear, COVID-like event happening to us.
Uncertainty.
And then obviously, it's good to get investors to come and place a value on your business, because until you do that, I don't chase media stories, but like recently Axios did a story that included us generally on digital media. The first question is, did you guys have any funding? I was like, yes. It's like, it's a shame. It's unfortunate that is a checklist item, but I also understand that it's a vetting process. Like, okay, some people have come, professionals in suits, they sized you up, they put you through a colonoscopy and you passed, so it's kosher type of thing. So that was all the reasons that we did it, but it doesn't change anything. It's still, as Vince Lombardi says, the score is for the guys in the stands. You have to just out hustle the guy across you on the line of scrimmage. And that's very true.
You also mentioned shutting up the haters. What does that refer to?
Okay, in the context here. So today, I won't lie. Ultimately, you're always it's like, what do they say? Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's got an asshole, whatever.
Yeah.
That line. So sometimes you could be like, let's use a house. Let's not talk about. So I could be like, my house is worth $50. You're like, my house is worth 20. You're like, your house is worth 20. I'm like, it's a $50 house. we could go back and forth. And yes, there's municipal assessments that are historical. But if somebody comes and buys the house for $50 and you sit there and you go, this is a $20 house, I'm like, dude, the house sold for 50. So shut the fuck up. You know, if you want to say it's 45, we could have a conversation. But if you're saying it's 20 when somebody came and bought it for 50, that's the price.
Yeah.
So now, if let's say in 2020, I don't need to tell people about the merits of YouTube. Like if today you still don't get the merits of YouTube, you're a moron. Like forget, I can't help you at this point. But if also you came and you said, well, WatchMojo is this and WatchMojo is that, I always go, there's some legit feedback. I don't view it as whining or haters. But if somebody goes, well, I don't see the point of WatchMojo is this and that, I'm like, well, look, these professional investors came and they valued us at $50, let's say, or $10. So who is you to be sitting here wasting my time? And also, I'm a finance guy. I taught finance at McGill. I was like 20 years ago doing valuation models for Wikipedia. But it's no longer just your stupid opinion and my stupid opinion.
Now there's a third party that's agreeing.
They came, they did their thing. They had more information on the business than you do sitting there with your bag of Cheetos in your basement. But sure, let's go on 4 more hours of back and forth. So yes, that was for me a big reason, because I would always tell them, building on YouTube, relying on this business model, doing this kind of programming will yield the best result. And people would say, no, and that was their right. But you shut up the haters when somebody comes and validates that. And that is a part that I had to accept, that entrepreneur at change. You could be profitable, but it's just your opinion. And it's just, you're just one business out of many. So you do need that third party validation, whether you like it or not.
Gotcha. Understood. Well, this was a great episode. We got some good engagement from the comments. I'm really happy with that. Next week, we were supposed to be featuring the launch of our documentary. I understand that there's been a bit of a delay on that.
So I'm an honest guy. So I don't want to lie. Half of it is doing this podcast, which, I mean, we share a few notes. For me, it doesn't take long to prepare. But the time I would have probably banged out the VO would have been done. But that's really half. That's not, I have enough time and I'm pretty prolific. The truth is, now that I'm going to Web Summit in Rio, and then off to Buenos Aires to meet some of our team that is in Argentina, I do want to just kind of soak that in a bit more, because one, in Argentina, I do want to talk to them because the team we have has a lot of interesting experience working in more traditional in the Argentinian media model. So I do think that is an interesting vantage point to just hear. I'm not even sure if any of it will go in it, but the global nature, how YouTube is also giving a new lease on life to a workforce that otherwise, hey, legacy media dying, you got to go work in insurance, nothing wrong with that. So one, I was like, wait for that. And I'm always asking questions, which gets me in trouble sometimes. But so I want to incorporate that. And then Rio is more anecdotal, because when I first went to a Web Summit event in Lisbon, I think 2018, and then Web Summit in Toronto is called Collision. When I did that in Toronto, it was a lot more the floor tech product entrepreneurs. So I do want to walk around and be like, hey, is there more of a creator presence? Granted, it's another geography, but so I basically said, go to Rio, kind of finish all the points, the notes, and then when I come back, I'll probably hammer it out. So we'll release it, either in a few weeks from now, or maybe even at the end of these 20 episodes, kind of as the culmination. But I did feel that it would be a shame not to use Rio. And I did my second documentary, Fox in the Henhouse, literally at Salt in Vegas at Anthony Scaramucci. So I usually use those settings a bit for, fodder.
Cool. So documentary still incoming, but
it's coming, yeah.
TBD. But in the meantime, next week we'll be talking about 2022 and the end of the ZERP era, which, to be honest, I don't know what the ZERP era is. So that'll be interesting for me.
The zero interest rate phenomenon, which was
there you go.
Yeah, which was a major game changer in the economy and our industry as well, just through a ricochet effect.
Fantastic. Looking forward to that. Thank you as always, Ash. It's always a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. You're too kind.
And thank you for everybody who watched, and we'll see you again next week. Take care, everybody.
Go Habs, go.
Go Habs, go.